My parents excluded me and my son for Thanksgiving. So, we made our own in the mountains. Hi, my name is Olivia. That evening, my shift ended at 7. I walked out of the emergency ward, surrounded by the familiar smell of disinfectant, the sleeve of my scrubs still marked with a faint trace of dried blood from a minor surgery. Outside, Portland was draped in a light drizzle. Raindrops slid slowly down the windshield as I sat in the parking lot, my hands still trembling after 12 straight hours at the children's hospital. I was about to call Eli, my 8-year-old son, to tell him I was on my way home, that tonight we would make pumpkin pie just like I promised. But before I could dial his number, my phone buzzed. A new message popped up in the family group chat. This Thanksgiving we're hosting your sister's fiancé. There won't be room for you and Eli at the table. I read it twice, then a third time, hoping I had misread it. Seconds later came another message from Abigail, my sister. But we want you to make the dinner, as always. And as if that wasn't enough, my mother added, and don't make us feel bad. I still want my gift. I stared at the glowing screen in the damp chill of the car, feeling as though someone had drawn a line straight through my world. No anger, no tears, just an emptiness so vast that even the sound of rain seemed to echo from somewhere far away. In the rearview mirror, I saw Eli's booster seat covered in superhero stickers he loved so much. He'd been counting down the days to Thanksgiving, excited to sit beside his grandparents and tell them about his new dinosaur model. I wondered how I would tell my son that this year, there was no seat for us at that table. If you were in my place, what would you do? And where and when are you listening to this story right now? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I sat there for a long while, listening to the steady rhythm of rain against the car roof, until the light outside turned into a soft, grayish violet. In that silence, something inside me began to rewind, like an old tape rolling backward. I was born and raised in Salem, Oregon, a small town with cobblestone streets and the smell of baked apples in the air every holiday season. Our house sat at the end of Ashland Road, vines draped over the porch, always filled with laughter but not always with room for me. I was the eldest, the child who always had to be sensible, while my sister, Abigail, was the light of the family. When I did homework in the kitchen, my mother would say, "Liv, watch your sister for me, I need to run out for a bit." But when Abby spilled milk or broke a dish, my mother only laughed, "It's okay, sweetie, you're just my little clumsy one." I learned early on what it meant to stay quiet, to clean up, take the blame, and never complain. I remember the holiday seasons when I was little. While other kids waited excitedly for Santa Claus, I was in the kitchen with my mother, peeling potatoes and mixing pumpkin pie filling. She used to say I had skilled hands, while Abby had the kind of face people fall in love with. Back then, I didn't fully understand what she meant. I only knew that every holiday, I would be in the kitchen, and Abby would be in the living room where the lights sparkled and everyone laughed. Time passed. I grew up, went to nursing school, and did everything I could to become someone people could rely on. When my father had heart surgery when I was 25, I quit my job for 3 months and came home to care for him every meal, every injection. I thought I was doing the right thing, fulfilling my duty as the eldest child. No one thanked me, but I didn't need thanks. I only wanted to see them smile. When my father recovered, he said something I'll never forget. "Without you, this family would fall apart." Strangely, it didn't sound like praise, it sounded like a sentence. From that day on, I silently accepted that I was the one responsible for everything. When Abigail married Benjamin, who at the time was just a new hire at a local bank, I planned the entire wedding by myself. I chose the flowers, booked the music, handled the decorations, and even paid for the band because my mother said, "You know how it is, Liv, money's tight." I didn't say anything, I just smiled, happy that my sister was happy. But as Abby walked down the aisle in her stunning white dress, I stood in the back of the church, my hands still dusted with flower pollen, quietly telling myself that I was fine. 3 years later, when my marriage fell apart, no one stood beside me in court except for the public attorney assigned to my case. I was 7 months pregnant with Eli when my husband left, leaving only a short note that said, "I'm not ready to be a father." I gave birth in the maternity ward of the same hospital where I worked, listening to my baby's first cry with a mix of fear and relief. From that moment on, I knew my life would only ever be about two people, me and my son. Eli was what I like to call my beautiful mess of light, smart, curious, and endlessly energetic. He started reading at 3 and loved taking things apart just to see how they worked. But when he began school, his teacher said he struggled to focus. A doctor later diagnosed Eli with mild ADHD, a form of attention deficit disorder. I never saw it as a problem. My son simply viewed the world differently, and that was what I loved about him. But my family didn't see it that way. Ever since his diagnosis, every family meal had turned into a test of patience. If Eli spoke too loudly, my father would frown. "Can't the boy sit still?" My mother would shoot me a look and say, "Liv, you have to teach him some manners, or no one will want to be around him." And Abby, with her usual smug smile, would add, "I heard there's medication that helps kids like him focus better." I used to want to reply that it wasn't my son who needed fixing, it was them who needed to learn understanding. But I swallowed my words every time, because that familiar voice in my head whispered, "Don't make it worse, they're still your family." That's how I lived for years, always the one holding everything together, cleaning up, absorbing the blows. When Mom needed someone to prepare Christmas or Thanksgiving dinners, I was the first she called. When Dad had hospital checkups, I was the one driving him. When Abby needed a babysitter for her toddler, I took time off my shift. I told myself that was what family meant, giving without expecting anything in return. But every time exhaustion hit, every time Eli asked, "Mom, why don't Grandma and Grandpa like me?" I had no idea how to answer. There was one time when Eli spilled cranberry juice on the white tablecloth, and my father exploded in anger. The entire table went silent, except for my mother's weary sigh and Abby's quiet remark, "Maybe next time, she should just leave the boy at home." Hearing that felt like being slapped across the face. That night, when we got home, Eli fell asleep in the back seat, and I sat in the car, crying without a sound. I felt like someone standing outside a glass window, watching a dinner I would never be invited to. Those memories flooded back like cold water rushing through my chest as I sat in the parking lot that night. I used to believe that if I tried hard enough, if I stayed quiet, polite, and useful, they would finally see me, maybe even love my son. But to them, I was only a convenient shadow, the one who made sure every celebration ran smoothly so others could shine. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had cared for countless patients, comforted crying children, and peeled hundreds of potatoes, whisked dozens of pies for a family that never once asked if I was happy. And that night, beneath the steady Portland rain, I realized something for the first time in my life. I didn't want to carry it anymore. I had done enough. And maybe, the bravest thing I would ever do was to stop trying. In the days that followed that message, the family group chat remained lively as if nothing had happened. They talked about what color tablecloth would look best under the dining room lights, how many bottles of wine they'd need for their special dinner, and whether they should hire a photographer to capture the precious moments. I read every message quietly without replying. At the top of the screen was Abby's profile photo, she and Benjamin smiling brightly on a yacht, her hand lifted to show off her sparkling engagement ring. In the corner, my mother sent a row of heart emojis with the message, "Benjamin's family is so classy, Liv, make sure everything's perfect, okay?" I read that line again and again, as if the meaning might change if I stared long enough. But it didn't. Perfect. That word clung to me for the rest of my shift. I lit a cigarette, watched the smoke dissolve into the cold mist, and thought about what I used to call family. This year's Reed Thanksgiving dinner wasn't just another holiday meal, it was the official introduction between two families. Benjamin was the only son of a wealthy restaurateur who owned a chain of fine dining establishments in Seattle. They lived in Queen Anne, where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. My parents couldn't hide their pride, they saw this as a social step up for the family name. And me, the single mother nurse with dark circles from night shifts, didn't fit into that picture. In the group chat, the messages came one after another. Don't forget your pumpkin pie recipe. Oh, and bring your carving knives like last year. And no drama this time. That last line from Abby, no drama this time, tightened something in my chest. What did she mean by drama? The moment last year when Eli spilled cranberry juice on the white tablecloth and my father stood up, yelling in front of everyone? Or when I tried to defend him, saying, it was just a small accident. And my mother coldly replied, accidents only happen to children who don't know how to behave. I remember it vividly. Eli stood there, his eyes red, his tiny hand clutching the edge of my shirt, his lips trembling as he whispered, I'm sorry, Mom. And me, instead of holding him, I lowered my head and wiped the stain in silence. That shame, that crushing quiet, it didn't just break my son's heart. It made me realize I had allowed others to teach him he wasn't enough. I thought after that year, they would finally understand that some wounds can't be masked by laughter or glasses of wine. But they didn't. This year, they made sure to remove both of us entirely from the list. It's just to make the table less crowded, Mom said in a short phone call. You understand, right? Benjamin's family is very traditional. They're not used to noisy kids. I listened quietly, then simply said, yes, I understand. But deep down, what I understood most clearly was this. Their love had conditions, and those conditions never included me. That night, when I got home, I opened my laptop and scrolled through hundreds of old Thanksgiving and Christmas photos. I saw myself in every picture, always in the background, covered in flour, hair tied up in a messy bun, smiling in that practiced, polite way. Abby was radiant at the center of the frame, a wine glass in hand, while my parents sat at the head of the table, pride written all over their faces as they looked at their successful daughter. And Eli, he was barely there. When I zoomed in, I'd sometimes spot just the top of his small head peeking from the corner, or a little hand passing a dish to someone else. I closed the laptop, feeling like I had just watched a movie in which I was the unnecessary extra. The next day, my mother sent another message. Liv, you're still making the stuffing and pumpkin pie, right? Everyone's looking forward to it. I started typing, no, I'm busy, but deleted it. I didn't want to explain, and I didn't want to beg. I just left it unanswered. Sometimes silence is its own way of saying, enough. At the hospital, while I was scrubbing in for a minor surgery, my colleague June asked, Olivia, what are you doing for Thanksgiving this year? I smiled and said casually, probably cooking for the family again. But inside, the real answer echoed differently. No, not this time. That evening, Eli sat by the window, pressing dried leaves onto the glass to make what he called a thankful tree. He said softly, Mom, this year I'm thankful that we still have each other. I smiled, but my throat tightened. My 8-year-old son understood something adults rarely do. Happiness isn't about a crowded table, it's about sitting beside someone who truly loves you. I looked at my son, and in that moment, I knew I was about to do something I had never dared to do before, stop trying to please everyone else. No more cooking for people who saw me as nothing more than free labor. No more asking for permission to exist in my own family. This year, there would be no pumpkin pie, no carving knives, no sweat dripping in their kitchen. Instead, I would prepare something different, a plan for just me and my boy. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the family chat again, watching the little word scene glow next to my name. They were still talking about which wine to buy and which photographer to hire. No one bothered to ask where I'd be having dinner. I smiled a tired, peaceful smile. Last year, I cried over this, but this year, there were no tears left. Because I understood something now. No one can exclude you from their table if you build one of your own. I took a deep breath and felt something shift inside, not anger but clarity. For the first time, I knew I was about to do the right thing, step out of the role of the helper in my own family and become the head chef of my own life. The next morning, the hospital glowed with its usual cold white light, the air filled with the scent of disinfectant and the steady beeping of monitors, a heartbeat of a world that never rests. I walked down the corridor, trying to keep my mind on work, but my family's messages still echoed in my head. Everything went on as usual. Doctor Martinez called me over to assist with an insulin injection for the patient in bed 12, a little girl with soft brown curls, pale skin, and bright, intelligent eyes. Her name was Nora. She was 10, diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and had been staying at the hospital for almost a month while they adjusted her insulin dose. While waiting for the test results, I sat beside Nora, both of us gazing out the rain-streaked window. She asked softly but clearly, "Do you have a family?" I smiled. "Yes, I have an 8-year-old son named Eli." Nora tilted her head. "Does he like Thanksgiving?" I paused for a few seconds before replying. "I think he does, but this year, things might be a little different." She looked at me with eyes far too understanding for her 10 years and said, "You don't have to be perfect to be loved, right?" Her question was as light as breath, yet it touched something raw inside me. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at her small hand resting on the blanket, the faint marks of IV needles still visible, and in that moment, I saw myself once a child who believed that if she was good enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, she would finally be loved. But love like that is just an exam you can never ace. When my shift ended, I stepped out onto the hospital's front porch. The Portland air had turned chilly, and Thanksgiving lights had just been switched on along Burnside Avenue, glowing softly against the rain-slick pavement. People passed by carrying grocery bags, pumpkins, laughter drifting through the wind. I watched them, families gathering, walking close, and the truth hit me with a sharp clarity. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a seat at a table that was never meant for me. I pulled out my phone and opened the family group chat. The latest message was from my mother. "Liv, make sure your oven still works. I don't want the turkey burned again like last year." I held my finger on the screen, then deleted the entire conversation. For the first time in years, the blank screen in front of me looked peaceful. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of rain mixing with the distant chime of church bells. In my mind, Nora's words echoed, "You don't have to be perfect to be loved." I whispered them to myself, letting them settle like a quiet vow. I was tired of chasing approval, tired of teaching my son that love must always come with sacrifice. Real love isn't submission. It's being seen, being accepted, even when you don't fit someone else's version of perfect. I went back to the break room, still in my scrubs, and opened my laptop. The keyboard felt icy beneath my fingers, but I typed with certainty. Best Thanksgiving weekend getaways for families in the U.S. Hundreds of results appeared, from ski resorts in Colorado to warm beaches in California. But my eyes stopped on a name I dreamed about for years: Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I clicked on the first image, a wooden cabin nestled among snow-covered pine trees, glowing with the soft light of a fireplace, the majestic Grand Teton Range standing tall in the background. Beneath it was a small tagline: "A place to breathe, to belong, and to begin again." Oh, mole. I read that line over and over, feeling as though it was speaking directly to me. A place to belong, a place to start again. My whole life, I had cooked for others, cleaned for others, lived in a house where I was nothing more than the woman in the kitchen. And Eli had grown up surrounded by the uneasy silence of dinners filled with judgment. Maybe it was time for the two of us to find somewhere else, somewhere no one told my son to sit still, somewhere no one made me apologize for simply existing. I checked the flights. There was still one ticket left from Portland to Jackson Hole, departing Wednesday morning, just 2 days before Thanksgiving. I hesitated for a moment. My mother's voice echoed in my mind. "How could you leave right before the holiday?" But this time, I let it fade away. I pulled out my wallet, entered my credit card information, and hit confirm. When the screen flashed, "Booking confirmed," my heart raced, not from fear, but from relief. I closed my eyes. For the first time in years, my mind felt as calm as a frozen winter lake. I didn't know what awaited us, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never cook another meal for people who looked down on my child. I had served them enough. Now it was time to serve my own life. The next morning, when Eli woke up, I was making pancakes. The smell of butter and baking powder filled our tiny kitchen. He ran over, hair tousled, grinning wide. "Mom, it's Tuesday. Only 2 days until Thanksgiving." I nodded, pouring syrup over his plate. "I know," I said softly. "This year, we're going to celebrate a little differently." Eli looked up, his brown eyes wide and curious. "Different? We're not going to Grandma's house?" I paused, meeting his gaze. "No, Eli," I said gently. "This year, we're going to have our own turkey dinner in a place where we're truly wanted." Eli looked a little surprised, then nodded after a few seconds. "Will there be pumpkin pie, Mom?" I laughed. "Yes, and hot chocolate too." At that, he jumped off the chair and ran to grab his old sketchbook, its corners frayed, its pages yellowed. "I'm going to draw everything we see on the trip," he announced proudly. I reached out and ruffled his hair, warmth blooming quietly in my chest. When did it become enough just seeing my child excited to make my heart finally feel at peace? That afternoon, we started packing. The golden light of sunset streamed through the blinds, stretching across the worn wooden floor. I folded clothes and tucked in Eli's thick gloves, while he carefully checked his own packing list, his red fox beanie, his plastic dinosaur, his box of crayons, and his favorite storybook, Where the Wild Things Are, the one I read to him every night. Each time he checked off an item, he cheered, "Done, ready for the adventure." I watched him, feeling as though I was looking at a smaller version of myself, only braver, freer. I was once the little girl who dreamed of leaving Salem but never had the courage to go. My son, though, had never learned fear. He'd never been taught that he wasn't enough. I wanted to protect that part of him forever, to keep it safe from the voices that might one day call him too loud or too much. When I closed the suitcase, I placed a small box inside a box holding a few photographs. Not of my family, but of me and Eli. One taken at Forest Park the day he first learned to ride a bike, another at Cannon Beach where we built a sandcastle that the waves later swept away. Those moments didn't need anyone's approval. They were happiness in its purest form. Outside the window, the sky had turned to steel gray, and the chill slipped through the cracks in the door. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down, surrounded by a silence that felt strangely comforting. No ringing phone, no to-do lists for others, no one giving orders. Just me, Eli, and our small plan, a plan that, to anyone else, might look like a simple vacation, but to me, it was the first step toward reclaiming my life. That night, my mother called. I stared at her name glowing on the screen, feeling my chest tighten. I knew this call would come, it always did. It was never to ask if I was doing okay, but to make sure everything in her plan was still on schedule. I let the phone ring until it stopped. A minute later, a text arrived. "Liv, I need to know if you're still making the stuffing. Don't let everyone down." I looked at the message for a long moment, then set the phone down without replying. I didn't owe them that kind of devotion anymore. Later that night, when Eli had fallen asleep, I quietly stepped into his room. His small face was peaceful, the face of a child the world once called different. He turned slightly in his sleep, murmuring something I couldn't catch. I leaned down and whispered, "You're going to see real snow this year, Eli." Back in the living room, I sat by the window. On the table were our printed plane tickets, the cabin booking receipt, and a small notebook where I planned to record our trip, not for anyone else to read, but to remind myself someday that there was a moment I finally chose freedom. I leaned back into the chair and felt my chest grow lighter with every breath. The weight of duty, guilt, and years spent trying to be the perfect daughter in someone else's eyes began to fade. For the first time, I felt like I was truly breathing. Not the kind of breath you take to survive, but the kind you take when you finally inhale a new life, one where no one else gets to decide your place at the table. I closed my eyes and smiled. Somewhere deep inside, I heard a voice, my own voice, gentle but firm. "You're enough, Olivia. It's time to live for yourself." Tuesday morning, just one day before Thanksgiving, Portland was soaked in cold rain. I brewed coffee while the sound of Eli's laughter filled the living room, his voice rising above the soft autumn hymn playing on the radio. We gather together. The same song I remembered from my own childhood. For a moment, I forgot my phone was still on the kitchen counter until the screen lit up, flashing again and again. One call, then another, then 5. All from the same name, Mom. I stood still, watching the string of calls light up one after another, as if someone were trying to break down the very door I had just closed. When the phone rang for the 6th time, I picked it up. My mother's voice burst through the speaker the moment I answered, sharp, hurried, desperate, as though if she stopped talking, she might lose control. Olivia. What are you doing? Everyone's panicking here. We've got 15 people coming for dinner and you're not answering any of my messages. Oh. I took a slow breath, keeping my voice calm. 15 people, Mom. I thought there were only 12 seats at the table. There was a brief pause on the other end before she replied, her tone clipped and defensive. Don't talk like that. You know it's just because the table's small. I explained that already. I looked out the window. Raindrops slid down the glass, catching the glow of passing headlights and turning them into blurred streaks of light. I spoke slowly, each word deliberate. It's okay, Mom. I've already bought the tickets. Her voice shot up immediately. Tickets? Olivia, don't tell me you're doing something foolish. I pressed my lips together and said softly, no, Mom, just tickets to leave. A silence stretched between us. I could hear her breathing, the faint sound of my father in the background asking, what's she saying? Then my mother's voice came again, a mixture of confusion and anger. Where are you going? You're abandoning your family on Thanksgiving? Abigail doesn't even know how to cook. I smiled, not bitterly, not mockingly, just tiredly. I'm sure Abby can order catering. Or you and Dad can cook. It's not that hard, really. I've been doing it for 10 years. I don't understand you anymore, Olivia, she shouted. I just want everything to be perfect. This family can't handle another problem. Then I guess you'll be relieved I won't be there, I said quietly, my voice steady. Eli and I are going away for a few days. You don't have to worry about us. I heard her stammer. You're taking the boy? Where are you going? To a place where we're actually wanted. And then, I hung up. No shouting, no drama, just a dry click, the sound of a chain snapping somewhere deep inside me. I set the phone down on the table and watched the steam rise from my cup of coffee. My heart was strangely calm. The guilt that had followed me for years, that constant shadow whispering I should apologize simply for existing, was gone. A moment later, the phone buzzed again. Messages from my mother, then my father, then Abby. Long paragraphs filled with exclamation marks and words like ungrateful, disrespectful, betrayal. I read every word carefully, not skipping a single line, then turned off notifications. I knew this script by heart. They would yell, then go silent, then pretend nothing had ever happened. But this time, I wasn't coming back. Eli came running in, his hair messy, clutching his sketchbook. Mom, I finished the cabin drawing. He held up the paper pencil lines forming a small house surrounded by trees, smoke rising from the chimney, 2 figures standing in front of the door, one tall, one small. I smiled and nodded. It's beautiful, sweetheart. Don't forget to bring it with you. We'll hang it up when we get there. That afternoon, I cleaned the apartment. It had never felt so quiet. No television, no phone buzzing with someone needing me, no familiar voice calling from the kitchen, Liv, can you give me a hand? I folded the apron draped over the back of the chair, the one I used whenever I cooked for my family, and felt as though I were folding away an entire chapter of my life. Around 6 o'clock, my phone rang again. It was my mother. I almost didn't answer, but then I thought maybe this was the moment to end things cleanly. I pressed accept. Her voice was hoarse, though she tried to keep it steady. Olivia, I just want to say, I don't want to argue. You know how I am, I just want everything to go smoothly, especially in front of Benjamin's family. Could you please help me this one last time? I took a deep breath and answered slowly. Mom, all these years, I've helped. I've cooked, I've cleaned, I've done everything you asked. But in return, Eli and I were always seated at the end of the table or sometimes not given a seat at all. This year, I don't want to teach my son that he has to apologize just to be allowed a place to eat. Silence filled the line. For a moment, I thought she had hung up until her voice came, soft but trembling. You're blaming me for loving Abby more, aren't you? I smiled, though tears slipped down my cheeks before I could stop them. No, Mom. I'm blaming you for never really seeing me, that's all. There was a sharp inhale, followed by her shaky voice. You'll regret walking away like this. I looked out the window, where the rain had begun turning into a thin veil of snow. No, Mom. I said softly, almost like a whisper. Not this time. I ended the call. When the screen went dark, the room fell completely silent. Only Eli's small voice floated from the bedroom, humming somewhere over the rainbow. I leaned my forehead against the window pane, letting the chill sink into my skin. What I felt wasn't victory, and it wasn't loss, it was calm. The kind of stillness that follows a storm. A rare peace that I realized I might have been searching for my entire life. I knew that by the time the plane lifted off tomorrow morning, everything would change. There would be no more cramped kitchen, no more crowded dinner table, no more role of the caretaker. Just me, Eli, and the open white road ahead. And for the first time in years, I could finally say, I'm not running away, I'm just leaving a place I was never truly invited to stay. That morning, Portland woke beneath a thick layer of fog that made everything outside look like it was wrapped in silver mist. The rain hadn't stopped, but it had softened gentle drops falling slow and steady, enough to blur the car windows and hush the city. I woke Eli with the smell of toasted bread and the quiet music playing from the kitchen radio. He rubbed his eyes, hair sticking up, and pulled on the red fox hat I had knitted for him last year. Ready, my little fox? I asked. He yawned, then nodded, hoisting his tiny backpack over his shoulders. Did you pack your sketchbook? I reminded him. Yes, Mom. And my crayons. And my storybook too, he said, his voice bubbling with excitement, his brown eyes bright with a joy I hadn't seen in such a long time. My old car rolled out from the narrow street beside our apartment, merging into the stream of early morning traffic. Raindrops slid down the windshield as the radio began to play Home by Philip Phillips, the familiar melody so warm it ached in my chest. Hold on to me as we go, as we roll down this unfamiliar road. I smiled and turned the volume down until the music became no more than a whisper. In the back seat, Eli sang along softly, tracing the raindrops that clung to the window glass. The city slowly faded behind us, the buildings, the bridges stretching over the Willamette River all dissolving into the pale morning fog. I realized I didn't feel regret. Something inside me had quietly closed, not loudly, not with finality, but the way an old door gently shuts on its own, without needing me to turn around and push it. On the way to the airport, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Eli drawing. He was sketching the curve of clouds, the falling raindrops, and in his uneven handwriting, he wrote, "Adventure with Mom." I couldn't help but laugh softly. To me, this trip just a few days away felt like an escape. But to him, it was the first adventure of his life. And maybe that's what motherhood really means. Showing your child that even when the world closes its doors on you, you can still open another one. At Portland Airport, the morning air was cold and silver gray. The lines were long but calm. I held Eli's small hand tightly as we passed through security. Everything unfolded with strange ease, as if the universe itself was quietly aligning so that I could leave without resistance. Before boarding, I turned off my phone. No messages, no reminders, no goodbyes. Maybe someone back home was angry. Maybe they were calling or flooding my inbox with blame. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel obligated to answer. As the plane lifted off the runway, the wheels let out a long, rough hiss before rising into the air. The light tremor beneath my feet made me grip the armrest, but Eli burst out laughing, pressing his face to the window and shouting, "Mom, we're really flying." I turned to him, watching the gray sky reflected in his brown eyes, and gently brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. Yes, I said with a smile, we're flying toward the snow. Outside, Portland shrank beneath us, becoming patches of green and gray melting into the clouds. I leaned back against the seat and took a deep breath. Eli kept his gaze fixed on the window, but within minutes, his head had tilted onto my shoulder, his breathing slow and soft, almost like a whisper. I didn't move. I just tucked the blanket back over him when it slipped from his knees. Watching him sleep, something quiet stirred inside me, not sadness, not joy, but a kind of deep serenity, as if every muscle in my body had finally unclenched after years of tension. My whole life, I had been circling someone else's table, making room for everyone else, forgetting that my son and I were still standing at the door. Now, as the plane broke through the clouds, I understood. I wasn't running away from family. I was going home to a place where love isn't conditional, where my son's laughter isn't an inconvenience. I whispered to myself, beneath the steady hum of the engines. I'm not running away, I'm just going back to where love lives. Although, outside the window, the sun began to rise over the horizon, pale gold spilling across the clouds, painting the cabin in a soft, honeyed glow. I placed a hand over my heart, feeling its rhythm steady, unhurried, peaceful. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt it beating in time with something greater, freedom. Jackson Hole greeted us with a soft, snow-covered afternoon. The first flakes of the season fell slowly, as if afraid to disturb the stillness of the mountains. From the small airport, we took a taxi winding through narrow roads curling along the base of the Teton Range, where tall pine trees stood on either side, their branches heavy with white. Eli pressed his face to the window, whispering now and then, "Mom, it looks just like a Christmas movie." I smiled. In the fading light of the evening, everything seemed washed clean of Portland's gray months, no traffic, no cold drizzle, just crisp air and the faint scent of pine carried by the wind. Our cabin sat tucked away behind a cluster of cedar trees. When I opened the door, a wave of warmth rushed out, carrying the smell of burning wood mixed with pine resin, and for a moment, I almost cried. The room was small, with wooden walls, a little kitchen, a round table by a large window facing the forest, and a white sheepskin rug laid out before the fireplace. Eli gasped, "Mom, it looks like a house from a fairy tale." Then he dashed around, exploring every corner until he stopped in front of the fireplace and declared solemnly, "We have to roast marshmallows here." I laughed, hanging my coat on the hook. "Yes, but only after we bake our pumpkin pie." While I prepared the dough, Eli busied himself arranging ingredients on the table. He carefully sliced the pumpkin, stirred the batter, and occasionally snuck a taste of sugar, his face full of concentration, like a tiny chef at work. When the pie finally went into the oven, the whole cabin filled with a sweet, warm scent. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, blanketing the windowsills in white. I looked out through the glass and saw the faint yellow glow from a nearby cabin flickering through the gathering darkness. It felt as if the world had shrunk to just the two of us, and somehow, that smallness felt perfectly, blissfully right. By late afternoon, we bundled up and stepped outside for a walk. The snow crunched softly beneath our boots, our breath turning into little white clouds in the crisp air. In the distance, a few other families were roasting meat and laughing together, but everyone kept to themselves. I held Eli's hand as we walked slowly across the open field, watching his tiny footprints form a neat trail ahead of us. The sky had deepened into a violet hue, and the moon rose round and glowing, like a slice of orange hanging in the cold evening sky. When we returned, Eli immediately pulled out his sketchbook and sat at the table with determination. "I have an idea," he announced, and in big blue letters, he wrote at the top of the page, "Thanksgiving Menu, by Eli Reed." Then he read each line out loud, like a little declaration. 1. Turkey sandwiches, because a whole turkey is too big. 2. Cocoa with extra marshmallows. Sen. Gratitude jar. I smiled and asked, "What's the gratitude jar, honey?" Eli looked up, his serious little face so earnest it made me laugh. It's a thank you jar. We each write 3 things we're grateful for and put them inside. Then at the end of the day, we read them out loud like opening presents. I nodded. That's a beautiful idea. You can go first. We found a small glass jar in the kitchen and stuck a label on it that read, "Our gratitude jar." Eli wrote the first note. "I'm thankful that Mom took me on an adventure." I smiled, my hands trembling slightly as I slipped my own note inside. "I'm thankful that my son reminded me what happiness feels like." When dinner began, there were no white tablecloths, no silver cutlery, just 2 mismatched ceramic plates, warm turkey sandwiches, and thick, steaming cups of cocoa. Eli raised his cup and said, "Cheers." A drop of chocolate splashed onto the table, and we both burst out laughing. Outside, the snow kept falling quiet, steady, and so breathtakingly beautiful that it made me feel small in the best way. I watched my son, his face glowing in the firelight as he told a story about an imaginary snow fox. It only shows up when someone laughs for real, and I realized I had just seen it, not in the forest, but in his eyes. After dinner, we sat by the fireplace roasting marshmallows. The orange flames danced across the wooden walls, painting soft, swaying patterns that moved like breathing. Eli said quietly, "Mom, I think this is the best Thanksgiving ever." I smiled and asked, "Why do you think so, sweetheart?" He paused, his voice small but certain. "Because here, nobody tells me to be quiet." I froze for a moment, then pulled him into my arms, holding him close. His little shoulders trembled against me, but not from the cold. When the fire burned down to embers, I glanced toward the gratitude jar sitting on the table. Inside were only a few folded notes, yet each one carried something I had forgotten, a simple kind of gratitude, quiet and honest. I picked one at random. It was Eli's. In his uneven handwriting, it read, "I'm thankful because Mom isn't sad anymore." My throat tightened. Not from regret, but from the realization that my son had seen the pain I had tried so hard to hide. That night, after Eli fell asleep, I sat alone by the window. Outside, snow blanketed the forest, and the moonlight turned the world silver white. I watched my breath fade into the glass and realized I was living a real Thanksgiving. Not one filled with people or lavish dishes, but one made of love and of a child who still believed the world was a kind place. I reached for one last slip of paper and wrote, "I'm thankful that, at last, I found peace." I folded it gently and dropped it into the jar. The soft click of the lid closing echoed in the still air, a small, complete sound, like the final period at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. The years of begging for a seat at someone else's table were over. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside me, spring had quietly begun. The next morning, pale sunlight filtered through the frosted window, casting soft golden stripes across the wooden floor, wrapping the cabin in a quiet warmth. I woke, made coffee, and sat at the small table, watching Eli still asleep, curled beneath the blanket. The red fox hat was still on his head, his tiny nose peeking out, rising and falling with each breath. A rare calm settled over me, the kind of peace I used to think could only be earned through sacrifice. I reached for my phone, which had been on silent since the day before. The screen lit up instantly, 67 unread messages. I raised an eyebrow, took a slow sip of coffee, and already knew what I was about to see. I opened the family group chat, read Family Thanksgiving 2023. Right at the top were frantic messages pouring in one after another. "Mom, Olivia, where are you? The turkey is frozen. What are we going to do with it, Olivia?" Abigail. "Mom is crying, Dad's panicking. We told everyone dinner is at 6. Dad. This is ridiculous, young lady. You're ruining Thanksgiving." Abigail. "Liv, you can't just disappear like this. What am I supposed to tell Ben's parents?" The screen filled with panic photos of a rock-solid frozen turkey sitting on the kitchen counter, and even a voice recording of my mother's trembling voice. "People are arriving, and the kitchen isn't ready." I read everything, feeling neither anger nor sadness. Just a strange, weightless sense of calm, as if I were watching a play I had once performed in, but long since left, while the rest of the cast kept acting, unaware the audience had already gone home. Setting the phone down, I listened to the soft whistle of wind outside the door and took another sip of coffee. In the warm room, with the faint smell of pumpkin pie still lingering from last night, their accusations suddenly felt so distant they were almost absurd. All these years, I had been the one they remembered only when things began to fall apart. When I was there, I was expected. Only in my absence did they notice the emptiness. The phone buzzed again. A new message, this time from Evan, my cousin in California. The only one in the family who ever truly asked if I was okay after the divorce. Evan. Good for you, Liv. You finally stopped being their maid. I laughed softly, a quiet sound that echoed through the small cabin longer than I expected. Not out of spite or triumph, just release. The simple relief of being seen. I typed back, "Thanks, Evan. I'm with Eli. We're doing just fine." He replied almost instantly, "That's all that matters. Don't feel guilty. They built that chaos themselves." I closed my phone and felt a quiet warmth spread through me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the one at fault. I stood and looked out the window. Snowflakes clung to the glass before melting into clear drops. In the distance, a family laughed as they skied down a gentle slope, their voices echoing through the valley. I whispered to myself, "They'll figure it out." When Eli woke up, he stretched, eyes still half closed. "Mom, what are we doing today?" I smiled softly. "We're going to bake another pie, take a walk around the lake, and tonight, we'll read the things we're thankful for." "Me too?" he asked eagerly. "Of course, you too." All day, I left my phone on the kitchen counter, untouched. Eli and I baked another batch of pie, then sat on the porch eating while snowflakes landed on his hair like tiny white candies. Every now and then, I heard the faint chime of new messages, probably Mom, or Abby, or someone trying to remind me how irresponsible I was. But this time, I felt no guilt. Their world might have been spinning in chaos, but mine, small, simple, peaceful, was moving at its own gentle pace. By sunset, the Tetons had turned to bronze beneath the fading light. I rested my hand on the window frame, feeling the warmth of the cabin against the chill outside, and in that moment, I understood something clearly. I no longer needed to prove anything. They would manage, or they wouldn't. They would blame, then forget. But what mattered was this: I, the one they had always labeled the dependable eldest, had finally learned how to let go. That evening, Eli wrote another note and slipped it into the gratitude jar. "I'm thankful that Mom doesn't have to be sad anymore," he said. I didn't answer, I just reached out and brushed his hair gently. Outside, snow kept falling, and somewhere far away, in the Reed family kitchen, they were probably still struggling with a frozen turkey. Yet, I felt no bitterness, no satisfaction. Just a quiet emptiness that somehow felt whole, as if my body had finally been returned to itself. I turned to Eli and smiled. "You know, sweetheart, sometimes silence is the best answer." He nodded, not fully understanding, but his eyes lit up, and maybe that was the most peaceful sound of the entire season. The next night, as the snow outside thickened until the cabin windows turned a hazy white, Eli and I were sitting by the fire, reading through a few notes from our gratitude jar, when my phone suddenly lit up. The name flashing on the screen was one I'd already expected: Abigail. I stared at it for a long moment, my finger hovering over the accept button. For an instant, I could almost hear my mother's voice echoing in my head. "No matter what, you're the older sister, Liv, you have to give in." But this time, I didn't. I took a deep breath and answered. There was no greeting on the other end, only the sound of heavy, uneven breathing, followed by a choked sob. "Liv, dinner was a disaster," Abby blurted, her voice cracking open like something she'd been holding back for hours. I said nothing, just let her speak. The turkey, it was raw inside, burned on the outside. Mom was screaming. Dad ordered Chinese takeout at the last minute. Ben's parents were horrified. I could hear paper crumpling, a glass falling somewhere in the background, And then her voice again, trembling. And when the food arrived, it was cold. Dad tried to play it off as some kind of fusion Thanksgiving, but Ben's mother, she saw right through it. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, listening to the muffled sound of snow falling outside. What I felt wasn't satisfaction or victory, just a quiet, distant calm. "How's Mom?" I asked softly. "She's still crying in the kitchen," Abby said. "She keeps saying everything always went perfectly when you were here. I win." Her words trailed off, as if she herself had just realized what she was admitting. Then her tone changed lower, slower, almost fragile. "Ben's mother asked who usually cooks," she continued. "I didn't know what to say at first, and then I told her it's you." I heard her shaky breath on the line. "She looked surprised," Abby said. "And she told me, you should be grateful to have a sister like that." Abby gave a short, broken laugh, half sob, half shame. "I didn't even know what to say, Liv. For years, I thought we were doing you a favor by letting you help, and now I see how cruel that was." A soft gust slipped through the window frame, making the curtains sway gently. Eli had been asleep for hours, his face calm under the warm glow of the fire. I listened quietly, saying nothing. Abby's voice came again, lower now, steadier but trembling at the edges. "Ben's dad talked to Mom afterward," she said. "He's a lawyer, but he used to volunteer with kids who have ADHD. When he heard about Eli, he said, he sounds brilliant. He said kids like him see the world differently, and that's not something to fix, it's something to learn from." Her voice caught. "He said families like ours often lose the best parts of themselves trying to look perfect for strangers." There was a long pause, filled only by the faint sound of her breathing. Then she sniffed softly, and when she spoke again, her voice was fragile but sincere. "Liv," she said, "I think I finally get it. What you've been feeling all these years, the pressure, the invisibility, how we made you feel like an outsider in your own family." I didn't answer right away. I stared into the fire, watching it fade to a low, orange glow. The logs cracked softly, and images flickered through my mind. Holidays past, me in the kitchen with flour on my sleeves, sweat beading on my neck, while laughter echoed from the living room. For years, I thought I was helping, when in truth, I was just bargaining for a little bit of acceptance. And now, hearing those words from the very person who had been most favored, I didn't know whether to feel healed or heartbroken. "Abby," I said quietly, "Mom and Dad didn't mean to be cruel. They just never learned another way to love. And you." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "You were the one they taught to expect perfection. We both got hurt, just in different ways." On the other end, Abby let out a small sob. "I don't deserve your kindness, Liv. Not after everything we did." I smiled faintly, though she couldn't see it. "You don't have to deserve it. You just have to understand it." There was a long exhale, the sound of someone trying to steady their voice. "Will you ever come back?" she asked. I looked out the window, where snow was still falling endlessly, blanketing the forest in silence. "Maybe," I said honestly. "But not the same way. If I ever come back, it'll be because I want to, not because I feel guilty." On the other end of the line, Abby gave a small laugh through her tears. "Ben's parents are staying at a hotel now. Mom tried to apologize, but it only made things worse. Ben told me he admires you, said he's never seen anyone stand up for themselves like that." I heard footsteps in the background, the soft creak of floorboards, and then Abby whispered, "You know what's ironic? It took your absence for them to finally see you." I sat there, watching the last of the fire fade into embers, and felt something inside me ease. "I'm happy for you, Abby," I said at last, my voice slow and soft, like wind drifting through snow-covered trees. "Maybe this year, you learned what family really means." There was only quiet breathing on the line before she replied, almost in a whisper. "Yeah, I think I did." She paused again, then added gently, "Tell Eli I said hi, and that I'm sorry too." "I will," I said quietly. When the call ended, I remained still, listening to the wind sigh against the roof of the cabin. But this time, there was no emptiness like before, only a deep, peaceful silence, the kind that falls when snow covers every sound. I set the phone on the table, tucked the blanket around Eli, and looked outside. The snow was still falling, soft and steady. And in that moment, I understood some apologies don't need to be loud, they just need to arrive in time to warm an entire winter. 3 months later, Portland had shed its gray rain. Spring had arrived. The sky stretched open in pale blue, and tiny green buds lined the path toward Waterfront Park. Eli and I stood in the middle of an outdoor playground, where a group of children gathered around a wooden art table, giggling as they built and colored together. On the table were crayons, cutout paper, and piles of Lego bricks, the Create and Grow community program for children with ADHD, where I had just started volunteering as a mentor. Eli sat beside me, his face full of focus. He was showing a younger boy how to build a bridge from popsicle sticks, his hands moving fast, his eyes bright with excitement. I watched him, a quiet pride blooming in my chest, the kind that words could never quite hold. The tired days, the long nights of being labeled difficult, they were behind us now. Eli no longer needed to shrink himself to fit. He was finally in a place where his imagination was called a gift, not a problem. I remember the morning I first received the email from the center. "We'd love for you and Eli to join our creative program for gifted children with ADHD." I must have read it a dozen times, hardly believing that my son, the same boy once called misbehaved at family dinners, had just been selected for the city's gifted STEM program. The day we got the news, Eli jumped onto the couch, shouting, "Mom, I'm going to build a talking robot." I couldn't help laughing as I pulled him into a tight hug. Life slowly returned to rhythm, but it wasn't the same rhythm anymore. In the mornings, I dropped Eli off at school before heading to the hospital. In the afternoons, the two of us volunteered together, helping other kids learn how to focus through creativity. I realized that once I stopped bending myself to please others, I had so much more energy left for the things that truly mattered, for Eli, and for myself. One quiet weekend afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting was careful, slanted. From Mom. My chest tightened slightly as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. She wrote about how, after Thanksgiving, she and Dad had a long talk. They had started seeing a family counselor, something I never thought they'd do. "We realized we've been so busy trying to look perfect that we forgot love doesn't need an audience," she wrote. "If you're willing, I'd love to see you and Eli again. Not to explain, but to start over." I folded the letter and sat still for a long moment. No tears, no anger, just a quiet tenderness, tinged with a little sadness, but real. I knew change doesn't happen overnight, but maybe, like melting snow, it only takes a bit of steady sunlight for the ice to start breaking apart. A few weeks later, the phone rang while Eli and I were baking. It was Abby. Her voice was calmer, softer. "Liv, I just wanted to tell you Mom's really trying. Yesterday, she went to the Autism Support Center and signed up as a volunteer." I smiled, watching Eli carefully sprinkle cinnamon over the pie. "Tell her thank you," I said, "but I'd like things to move slowly, to start again, with boundaries this time." There was a short pause on the other end before Abby replied gently, "Fair enough." I knew, in that moment, that Abby's words marked something my family had never truly known before: respect. In May, Eli entered a small competition at his school's STEM program. His project was a tiny robot that could write "thank you" when triggered by a voice command. When the teacher asked, "Where did you get the idea from?" Eli answered, "From my mom. She says gratitude isn't about bowing your head, it's about lifting it and smiling." The room burst into laughter, and as I stood in the last row, my vision blurred with tears I didn't bother to wipe away. That evening, Eli and I walked along the Willamette River. The city shimmered in the sunset, a soft breeze brushing through my hair. Eli held my hand, swinging it as he talked about his next project, a happiness machine that would play music every time someone said something kind. I listened, smiling, thinking that maybe he was already my happiness machine. When we got home, I took out the gratitude jar we had brought back from Jackson Hole. The glass was still clear, filled with folded notes, little pieces of our journey. Thank you for smiling more. Thank you for not being afraid to make mistakes. Thank you for us. I added a new one, writing slowly. Thank you for finding myself again, not at someone else's table, but at the one I set for myself, where I pour the wine and invite only those who belong. I dropped the note in, sealed the lid, and heard the soft click echo in the quiet. Outside, spring rain began to fall. Not cold this time, but warm. I watched Eli run onto the porch, arms outstretched, catching the raindrops. He looked up and laughed. Mom, the rain looks so pretty. I stepped beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. Yes, I said, because this time, I'm not afraid of it anymore. And standing there beneath the glimmering rain, I finally understood. Gratitude isn't about bowing your head and enduring, it's about lifting it, smiling, and walking forward with hands still open to love, but a heart that has learned where to stop. Inside me, there was no anger, no regret, only one clear thought. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes, it's the child you raise, or the self you reclaim, the one who stopped begging for a seat and built a table worth sitting at. I used to think Thanksgiving was about cooking, about long tables, perfect dishes, and keeping everyone happy. But now I know the truth, it's about gratitude. For life, for those who stay with open hearts, and for yourself, for being brave enough to walk away when you must. Now I understand that family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes, it's the child you teach to bake in a small cabin while the snow falls outside. It's the friend who listens when the world turns away, or, simply, it's you when you decide to stop asking for a seat at someone else's table and build one of your own with grace and dignity. If you're listening to this story, remember, you don't need an invitation to be worthy of love. Pour yourself a glass of wine, sit down, and smile. Because sometimes, the most beautiful feast is the one where you sit alone, peaceful, free, and whole.